meditation, I'm going to read a brief excerpt now from the writings of a certain famous thinker by name J. Krishnamurti. It's on death, and you can contemplate and take these words deep as you sit in meditation and receive them from your heart. Death is an extraordinary thing. Death is the unknown. You cannot come to it with the known. You cannot come to it with all your burdens. It is going to strip you of everything: your family, your children, your character, your ambitions. It is going to strip you of everything. So why not strip yourself of it right now? Strip yourself of all that, and then you will know what death means. I assure you, when you do know it, you will know great beauty. Then you will know what love is, because death, love, and beauty all go together. The thing that you call love is not love, but mere memory. What you love is your personal investment. What you love, your family, is a continuity of yourself. Your family is your own immortality, your own continuity. And when you die, there is no family, because nothing exists outside of you. Welcome back, friends. This has been very inspiring for me, and I hope it has been for you too as you think about this, because we'll be spending 4 weeks together. And last week, we started with this interesting discussion on what is death, and we read some of Master's writings. And this week, I had a few things to talk about, but I was sharing with some before the class began. I had an interesting 24 hours. Last night around 1 a.m., a very dear friend of mine had some health challenges, and I went to the ER, and he was in extreme pain. And I got back around 3:30, so it was an interesting night in itself. But also just being with somebody in chronic pain I myself was sort of, in a hazy state, to say the least. It took me, even as I was driving my car, and even I was getting, pulling into the ER, it took me more time than it usually would to figure out where to park or how to go inside or what to do, because it seemed like my body and mind were trying to be asleep where I was trying to do other things. But then even in that state, it was sort of a very interesting experience, because when I came back to bed at 3:30, it lingered on, that feeling of pain itself. What pain is, what do we experience through our bodies? It doesn't matter what we think detachment is, how detached we feel we are. When we are subject to this condition called pain, there is an inherent response that kicks in. And this was the discussion that we were having yesterday. How much do we actually suffer when we die? And there were a lot of questions around maybe there is a certain release. And Master was giving this rather gruesome description of the intense pain that one goes through when you cross through those portals, when you're trying to detach from your body. Does everybody feel that pain, or are some people just happy to be relieved? I don't know the exact answer, but if I were to guess, I think it's a mix of both. There is a great relief, and yet there is great pain, because sometimes the relief itself is from pain, and the pain itself is attachment. Because if we are at a state where we are completely disidentified with the body, the ego, and all the bondages that we hold on to this plane, then we wouldn't suffer because of pain. The fact that we even experience pain and that makes us suffer in itself is indicative of a certain ego-based attachment. And anyway, it's all, what I'm saying is perhaps rather self-evident, but these are all things that were high on my mind. And then I got up late. I had a full day of meetings, and then I was just going from meeting to meeting. I knew what my day looked like, but then suddenly I realized it was 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock whenever I looked at my clock, and I had to have lunch. I hadn't eaten since morning. I had scheduled a molar root canal today. And that just was another interesting experience and adventure on top of it, because for reasons that I don't understand, I don't need to explain, it turned out to be more complicated than what the dentist expected. It took about 2 hours, 20 minutes for her to figure out how to do it, and there were certain issues. And also because it's like way in the back, just all of us have gone through this. I'm not describing anything unique or special, but let's just call it unpleasant, because just even that feeling of needing to keep your mouth wide open, and I was at this reverse incline angle, and at the 1.5 hour mark, I was getting so restless because I was starting to feel pain around my neck because of the way I was laying on that chair, and there was no way to fix it. And I was trying every possible affirmation thought pattern I could. It worked for about 1.5 hours, I can tell you. But after that, it was like, please tell me this is going to end soon. Can you please tell me? And I think she was not even telling me because it was not about to end soon. And I could see, because she was going to do a filling at the end of the root canal, I can see she is not doing that. So there are still more steps before she gets there. Anyway, I'm still numb on my right side as I'm speaking right now. I just got back an hour or 1.5 hours ago from the dentist. I'm sharing all of that in the same vein because it was another direct experience of pain, because, she obviously numbed me. And then, there are points where she touches something and there's something goes somewhere, and then you don't know where exactly she put that injection, and suddenly, oh, how are you doing? Are you feeling anything? I am, of course, not just the pain of the neck or the jaw as you are sitting in the dentist chair, but also the nerve pain sometimes when they hit on things, which happens all the time, even if you take Novocaine. You're not an anesthesia, it's just an injection that's local. So, it is an experience all too familiar for all of us. I'm sharing all of this because it was just on the top of my mind. And, it sort of really ties so closely with this topic of death. And I wanted to touch upon a few things before talking about the actual subject matter that I had in mind for today. And the other thing that I wanted to share, which it'll all tie back together because all of it is related to our discussion and the topic at hand. I forgot to share this last week as the discussion went in many different directions. Just before the class last Wednesday, so today is April 10th, and last Wednesday was April 3rd. On April 3rd in the morning, this was not related to any internet search I was doing. This was just on news. I came across this news article. I don't remember the title, but you can look this up. This was a news article from April 3rd. This was, I don't have this bookmarked right now to read it for you. This was the story of a lady in Netherlands. She's 28 years old. I think her name is Zoraya Terbeek. You can look it up. I'm almost sure. That's why I wanted to remember that in case any of you wanted to read it, because it's interesting. I would recommend that you actually find this news article and read it. She's 28 years old, and she has chosen to unalive herself. And she is, in a lot of European countries, especially Netherlands, is quite well known for legalizing euthanasia. And there is an evaluation process, but a lot of freedom and choice is vested in the hands of the individual. So you ultimately can make a strong case, and there is no legal system that would prevent you from taking your life. Basically, it is a form of suicide. And it was a very interesting and a heart-wrenching news article. This lady has battled a lot of mental health conditions throughout her life. She has been diagnosed with depression, and whatever treatment options she has tried, they have not worked that well for her. And she has given it she has given all of it an honest shot. And basically, this is her interview, and she's describing all of this. And she says, I thought about it in my own mind. I'd also told my psychiatrist and psychotherapist and everybody, if this doesn't work, if this doesn't make me better, I'm going to keep trying. But if I don't improve, I'm going to give up. And in my case, giving up means I don't want to live in this body. I'm done. I don't want to live in this world. And the news article was heart-wrenching because of the amount of details that it went through. You had this picture of this very attractive-looking young woman with her boyfriend. Her life is almost idyllic. It's just almost picture perfect. She has this boyfriend. I think she has pets. She lives not in any urban area. She lives somewhere in the countryside in a beautiful house. And her boyfriend is so caring. He has been with her through this journey. And she's not in close touch with her biological family, but it seems like she already has a beautiful family of her own. And then she goes on to say, she's still alive as I'm speaking. There is a date set in May. The news article didn't want to share the date and when this is actually going to happen. But then it goes through all the details as she's describing. We are going to go urn shopping. I don't want him to take care of my grave. I don't want him to go keep cleaning and, the upkeep of the grave and all of that. We are going to find a beautiful urn where I can reside once I leave this body. And then she says, I don't want any music. I don't want anything and she's already decided. It's in great level of detail when the healthcare professionals, the medical professional come to her house. She has picked her favorite couch. She's going to lay down on her couch, not on the bed. She wants to be in the living room. And they're going to give her the injection. And there's going to be a whole process so that it happens in a pace that she can integrate and process as she's going through it. And it just went on into great amount of detail. And, she said, I don't want a funeral because I don't think anybody will come to my funeral. And she already went with her boyfriend somewhere in the forest, and she picked the place where she would like for him to scatter some of her ashes. And anyway, it just goes on and on. But this is the one part that was even more interesting. She says, I have a tattoo on my shoulder. It is a tattoo of the tree of life, but it's the reverse of the tree of life that I got a few years ago. And in my mind, I was imagining reverse of a tree of life. It's like upside down, like the root facing up. Like, so what? I mean, how does it make any sense? And then I scrolled down. There was a picture of her with her tattoo on the shoulder. What she meant by the reverse of the tree of life was the tree of life is, the roots are going into the earth. They are drawing all that prana up, and it's a big, huge tree, and it's sometimes depicted with birds and life and fruits and all of that. It's a picture of life. And her tattoo was this tree that was dying. His parched roots, broken branches, and leaves falling, and there's no birds flying away from the tree. And you can see this tattoo that she had. The first thought, I'm not sharing this story to have any opinion about euthanasia or anything like that. It's a complex topic. We don't need to get into that exactly in this discussion. But somehow that whole story in the news article was just such a visual commentary on death and life and our relationship with it, and so much more. I'll actually read this. This is the only thing I noted down for sharing. These are her. You did? Yeah. Yeah, you can, I'm sure, write Netherlands women euthanasia. These are some of her words from the interview. I'm a little afraid of dying because it's the ultimate unknown. We don't really know what's next, or even is there anything. That's the scary part. I mean, obviously, you can relate to it. There's nothing, she's just a normal lady, not unlike anybody else fighting depression, that you might see in your life. And anyway, coming back to the tree of life, but this was the thing that struck me the most, and which I thought is an important commentary on the topic we are discussing. To me, when I saw that tattoo, and I sort of zoomed in on that picture and looked at that tattoo that she had, and I thought, there's nothing sad about this. There's fall, and then there's spring. It's just a tree. Leaves fall, leaves grow again. This is not a commentary. This is not depressing. This is not hopeless. This is just a cycle. There's nothing called eternal spring. There's nothing that says, you cannot just freeze time. At a point, nothing, there's no life that doesn't go through the passage of time. There is no tree that somehow becomes this picture of bounty and abundance and life and just then freezes there for you to just behold for the rest of existence. Something happens after that. Then there's fall, and then there's spring again. And I was thinking all of this, not that I can, any of these words or these ideas would make any sense to this person because she has obviously reached a certain point and made choices for her life. But it is the same broken relationship that our culture has with death. this idea of death being the end, and death being associated with regret. I'm going to extend some of these discussions next week too, because there's so much that I wanted to share, and I was writing notes today, and I had to be careful because we can be here for a long time, and I want to focus on a certain theme every week. So we'll pick up this thread next week also, but I wanted to start there because that addresses the fundamental misunderstanding and our broken relationship with death. Another reading that I'll just briefly share before moving on is I've been obviously reading, and it's been inspiring for me, just not only reading all of Master's teachings, but also different experiences that people have with death and their perspectives. And I came across this Christian author, a pastor, and seems to be a philosopher and a writer. He seemed to be very mystical and authentically spiritual to me just from his writings. And the point that I wanted to mention, and then I want to go visit some of the sections of the Bhagavad Gita based on Master's teachings today. That's the plan for this evening before we dive into the activity, is the idea of befriending death. And I'll read this, and then I'll comment on that a little bit more as to why that is an important theme for us to focus on. This man's name is Henry Noel. He's a Christian author, but also he seems very broad, not in any narrow dimension of Christianity. Befriending death seems to be the basis of all the other forms of befriending. I have a deep sense, hard to articulate, that if we could really befriend death, we would be free people. So many of our doubts and hesitations, ambivalences and insecurities are bound up with our deep-seated fear of death, that our lives would be significantly different if we could relate to death as a familiar guest instead of as a threatening stranger. This idea, as I was thinking and meditating on it, seemed very important to me, especially given my last 24 hours, which I've been thinking just in the last hour of this class and the material for today. Befriending death, the idea of befriending death can be extended to befriending pain, to befriending aging, to befriending deterioration of the body, to befriending illness, to befriending disease, to befriending fall. The falling leaves of the tree, which is just the essential part of the cycle of rebirth. And it is the essence of how we relate. There was a different article, and somebody had written a eulogy for her mother. I don't know where I read. I didn't save the article to read it for you right now. But this was a letter that this person was writing, or maybe it was something he read as a eulogy. He was saying the extent to which I don't fully process and accept this person's passing is the extent to which I haven't understood life itself. And I thought, I'm not saying anything too foreign or out of our understanding, but I thought it was a really succinct way of putting it. The extent to which we have trouble looking at and processing death and illness and pain and old age and all the things that we go through and people around us go through is the extent to which we don't ourselves fully understand the nature and purpose of life. And the more we progress in either direction, the other naturally complements, and it becomes a part of how we relate to life itself. It changes how we live. And this idea of befriending, it's an idea, and I'm going to explore this more. I don't mean to leave this so hanging, but I thought I'll just briefly mention it before moving on to a related subject. But I want to explore it next week with two related ideas of hope and faith, which, as I've been thinking and reading and meditating on it, to me felt like very, very central concepts when we are thinking about any of these topics. I mean, this class and the whole theme we are exploring is death. However, as I was sharing last week, I think it's impossible to separate it from grief, from disease, from pain, from aging, from so many other things that are not essentially the end of our lives, but things that are hard for us to directly cope with, that challenge us in a very, very real way, no matter where we are in our journey, because these are things that are so real that they ground us in the body, in our ego. They almost painfully make us aware of the fact that we still have egos, Suddenly, just like even in a meditation, you just are having a great experience, and you're having a beautiful meditation, and then your legs fall asleep, or suddenly your lower back cries for attention. It's not any different. It's just that there are these reminders constantly telling us, no, you're still bound. You're still bound. And you have to work your way out of this. You have to do what it takes to come out of this consciously. Because until you do that, there is inevitable suffering. There is no way to end it until you find a way to come out of this consciously. And you have to do it. You cannot assume. It's not an affirmation. It's not theory. It's not a book. It's not an idea. It is your own process of expanding your realization, your consciousness, your understanding, opening your heart to process and integrate all of this so you can ultimately transcend. And that's the promise. That's the promise. When you befriend death, you have befriended life. And you cannot befriend life. You cannot live fully until you have befriended pain and death and suffering. I'll share one brief story before moving on to sharing something from the Gita. This is a dentist story too. All of us, many of us, I'm sure, and hopefully all of us in the room have heard stories of Swami Kriyananda, talking about how he sits on the dentist chair and, he doesn't take Novocaine, and he sits through that pain, and then he gives tactics on, what you could do if you wish to try that. And I happen to be, I am very inspired. All of us take whatever part of the teaching appeals to us, and depending on our personality and our own inclination, Master uses the word spiritual adventuresomeness. And that is something that resonates with me, and it somehow inspires me. And I try to be spiritually adventuresome. So this was many, many years ago, and I don't know if I'll do this again in this incarnation. And so I was at the dentist, and he was replacing the temporary crown with a permanent crown. I'm sure probably all of us in the room have done that. And, then I sat in the chair, and I sort of casually brought this up with him. Hey, I was just wondering, you're not going to drill anymore, are you? And he said, I have to, because, the crown doesn't come in the exact shape. When I take the temporary crown out, there'll be a little bit of drilling, but, I'm not going to be cleaning cavity like I did the first time. I was just wondering, I'm curious if I can try this without Novocaine. Can you just do this without giving me Novocaine? And let's just try putting this, where the story is headed. But I'll tell you, I did go through the whole thing, and I did put the permanent crown without Novocaine. But that's not the real story. That's not where it ends. It was painful, and I used every ounce of my willpower that I had. But this was the painful lesson that I was left with at the end of this, which is, this is where you have to really face into who you are and really try to do this one step at a time if you really want to come out of it. As, whatever the saying goes, patience is the shortest route to God. You really have to work with every part of who you are and integrate before you can reach your goal. And as he was drilling, the pain was intense. And you know how the nerve pain, with tooth is, it sort of hits you somewhere, and then you're feeling it in your cheek, in your head. It's sort of like traveling all over your body, and you're like, what's happening? Get me out of here. And your body twitches. You're sort of like, and I was really trying to not be dramatic on the dentist's stairs, because, I didn't want him to be scared. I didn't want to... I didn't want to create a scene, but, it was over in 20 minutes. It was just pudding. But this is what happened. Somehow, maybe Master was just trying to teach me a lesson. I had just resolved so intently that I was going to do this. I went through those 20 minutes. Somehow I lived through that. But this is what I was left with. I had this pain on the right side of my face for days. The shock that my body went through because of going... If I had Novocaine, honestly, for replacing a temporary crown with a permanent crown, I would not remember that after 4 hours, as soon as the numbness goes away. But it was such an illustrative lesson for me, because my body actually had the ability to cope with that pain if it could be numbed. If I could be unconscious, this is so within my capacity to deal with that pain. But I do not have the ability to do this consciously. That I had not befriended this pain, that this pain was my enemy, and I was not going to invite it. I was not going to sit with it. I was not going to accept it. And because of that, even though I was enduring it, I was left with this hangover that was just so painful that just left me thinking, how life happens. Never again. Give me an extra dose, numb my whole mouth. I'm not doing that again. Maybe I'll change my mind, but it's not that many years ago that this happened. But I wanted to share that, just that idea. But, still, where we are, this is the practical thought I will leave with all of us just to sit with. Again, from the experiences that I just shared in my own life, it comes to us in ways that are small and doable and manageable. Because there are a lot of things in our own bodies, in our own minds, where you can just let go of resistance. You don't even have to, not take that Tylenol if you have a headache. It's sometimes even just going for a walk when you don't feel like it. Sometimes just relaxing and getting into the flow without resistance. Because it is a very subtle concept that I really cannot articulate or talk about too much. Because what I was describing was the way not to do it. Because it's not just a function of brute willpower where you display your endurance. It's an actual act of reducing your resistance from within. And that is what befriending pain means. It is different from enduring or tolerating pain or conquering pain. It is about transcending pain, which is very different from conquering pain. Sometimes you have to conquer pain. Sometimes you have to endure pain. But there is a lesson for all of us in working with our bodies, because it is essentially what we face when we have to detach from our bodies. And all of us have gone through this in some form or the other, where we are not left with a choice. Rita is taking notes, and I'm sure she can share a lot of her own experiences. She just went through a very significant accident that, your body is not expecting it. It takes a heavy physical toll. And then whether or not you like it, you just have to go through it one step at a time until you can just let go. You can just get into the flow. This is what is happening. And if I need to take painkillers, I need to take painkillers. But I don't have to make pain my enemy. I don't have to constantly create this image of fighting something that I don't want, but rather accept the leaves falling from the tree, accept everything as just the process of life. The aging of the body is inevitable. There's nothing that can stop that. I've been around, I think 13, 14, whatever, I've been around Ananda. And, I came to Ananda at a time where, things started getting documented through photos heavily. So I just look. I was even sending somebody a recording. They wanted something, and I wanted to send a class that I taught in 2021. And I sent them a video, and I took the link from YouTube, and then I suddenly started watching the video. Like, is that what I looked like in 2021? Wow. It's almost humbling. But also, it is just, I'm sharing some things that are so obvious, but you just sort of like, it startles you a little bit. Wow, I had a lot more hair, or I was slimmer, or whatever it is. Just to know that this vehicle is just constantly mutating, and that mutation is the order of life, and always relating and tuning into that which is not mutating, to always have awareness and strongly hold on to something that is beneath and beyond that mutation. Now, with that, coming to a few other thoughts I'll share just before we again transition to another interesting activity for this evening. We talked a little bit about, I was reading from the autobiography of a yogi last week about the idea of what happens when we die, and, this concept of how most people end up in a stupor. That's what deep stupor, that's the word autobiography of a yogi uses. And then I actually realized as I was reading the Gita commentaries this past week, Swami also uses the same word. There are a lot of verses. I would highly recommend, again, I seem to be giving a lot of homework and reading assignment. The 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is actually a lot about death, mutation, liberation. I would highly recommend it. And I was thinking about it today, and I had a different conversation yesterday with somebody about the 8th house in Vedic astrology. I'm not going to go into it. It's just an intellectual fascination. It really doesn't matter, which also has to do with mutation and death. And that's what the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita also is. The number 8 itself is the house of Saturn, and it's the house of the material plane shifting and turning. So, with that, I want to read just brief excerpts from the Gita commentary and touch upon this topic because it's a very important concept when we think about preparing for the final exam. This is verse 5 of 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He who at the hour of death thinks of me only enters unquestioningly into my being. I'm going to read that verse again. He who at the hour of death thinks of me only enters unquestioningly into my being. 8:6. O son of Kunti, the uppermost thought in a person's mind as he dies determines his next state of existence. O son of Kunti, the uppermost thought in a person's mind as he dies determines his next state of existence. Therefore, remember me and fight the battle. Surrender to me your mind and understanding. In doing so, you will without doubt come to me. Verses 8:9 and 8:10. The yogi at the time of death attains that supreme effulgent state, provided that, with deep love and focused power through the practice of yoga, he succeeds in penetrating his conscious energy through the kutastha, between the eyebrows, and he maintains his attention unwaveringly on that being who, beyond all delusions of darkness, shines like the sun, whose form is subtler than the finest atom, who is the ultimate support of all and the great ruler, eternal and omniscient. The Gita is extremely instructive. There's a lot of commentaries written which are all essential and without which we cannot understand what Krishna is really teaching. But if you really go through the verses of Gita, there is not a lot of fluff at all. There's not a lot of explanation. It's just to the point and it's very, very instructive. And this teaching is an extremely important one and is actually very practical. It's not esoteric. Where Krishna says, whatever you think of at the time of death, that's where you're going to go. Whatever thought is uppermost in your mind at the time of death will be your next state of existence. And there are many, many stories in Hindu mythology. There's a story of how the sage was, thinking of a deer when he died and he reincarnated as a deer. And it actually is something that is an essential part of the Hindu way of understanding life itself. Now, the important point here, which is illustrated here by Swami through a story, which he also used to share in talks, and it's a story that he writes in other parts of his writings also, which I'll share with you right now, because that story is important to understanding what it means to think of something at the time of death. The story, again, this is not a story that Swami created. It's a story that I've heard well before I came onto this path, I think even from my childhood. It is said in the Hindu mythology, that Hindu culture, that if you die in the city of Varanasi, then you will be liberated. So even today, there are people that would just go to Varanasi at their old age, and they would just live there. Even people who enter hospice, there's no concept of hospice in India, but even people who reach that stage of life, they generally just renounce everything, or don't renounce, take everything they have and buy a house in Varanasi. It's all still common. And death is treated very differently in Varanasi. It's the city of death. It's just the most beautiful and the glorious thing about being in Varanasi. There's no words to describe it. And there is this dacoit, a person, a robber, who used to steal all his life, who then realizes or hears this. And he even goes through his life and his career assuming that this teaching is true. So if he dies in Varanasi, he's going to be liberated. So what's the big deal? He can do whatever he wants. And then he just lives the dissolute life that he does. And then at the end of his life, he sort of takes all of his belongings and moves to Varanasi. Not only that, he actually chops off his legs. So he's just going to stay there, that he wouldn't be tempted to leave the boundaries of Varanasi. The city of Varanasi has clearly marked boundaries in scripture. There's a tributary called Varuna and Asi. The point where Varuna meets Ganga and where Asi meets Ganga, the banks of Ganga between these 2 points is called Varanasi. You can just walk the whole stretch in an hour. And so he just goes there and he says, I'm not going to cross these boundaries. I don't even have legs. And then one day he's just sitting there doing nothing because he cannot move around. He sees a man riding a horse. And then he sees, and then, he tells this man, he just still has the sarcastic, negative vein in him, and he just looks at him and says, you can't even ride this horse. It's such a great horse. You're doing a terrible job. Even without legs, I could do a better job of riding this horse than you can. And then so, as you can see where the story is headed, he gets upon that horse to show this man that he can do a better job of riding the horse even without legs. And the horse immediately gallops and takes off as soon as this lame dacoit sits on this horse. And it leaps out, it crosses the river, it crosses the boundary of Varanasi, and topples him and kills him by stomping on him. It's not a real story, it's apocryphal, it's just a symbolic story. But the story is told to illustrate an important teaching, because even when we are told things like all your sins will be washed away when you take a dip in the Ganges, or you will reach liberation if you die in Varanasi, it does not preclude, what we hold in our hearts. There is a way in which life works itself out. These are not ways in which the ego can take charge and determine the course of what happens to the body and mind. These are ways in which you can surrender your ego. So if you're going to try to use the teaching, it's not going to work exactly in the way that you plan. And it is important in this particular context because it is actually not a consolation to think that I'll just think of God when I take my last breath. It doesn't work that way. And I have to tell you, I don't know how many of you saw this email. I'm looking for my phone. Right before I drove to the class, Naiswami Padma, who lives in Seattle, she sent an email out, to a large group of people. It was just a joke. It was humor that she sent this tiny little cartoon out to a lot of us. And I'm sure many of you in the room may have received this. This is just a Buddhist monk boy sitting with an elephant and talking. He says, the mind, I think, is like tofu. It tastes like whatever you marinate it in. We will talk about these things a little bit more next week. But, as a brief summary, that's really the true teaching, which is the hour of death is the summation and the culmination of the entire life itself. It is not a discrete moment that we can individually control in and of itself. It is truly the summation of every thought, every action, every breath, every intention that we have had through those years of existence. It cannot be controlled independently. A horse may not take you out and, stomp you to death somewhere, but the inner demons, again, we were talking a lot about the Tibetan Book of the Dead last week, and Master actually makes a reference to it. If I have time, I'll read that briefly also, or maybe I'll read that. In the same section that I was reading last week, all of the things that are unresolved within us comes to fore. It starts precipitating, it starts coming to surface at the moment of death. And, again, the time we have for discussion is rather brief. I have so many experiences from my own life of watching that in people. It sort of shocks you. You did not imagine that this person had it in them. Or rather, sometimes even not to think of unpleasant or gruesome things. Sometimes people would even have strangest of cravings. It is so common. You can ask anybody who has been involved in end-of-life care or hospice. They're so irrational. It has nothing to do with any disease or condition of the body that they're going through. People would crave mac and cheese or chocolate cake or coffee or a certain kind of cracker. I've heard all of these things. Somebody was referring to the book Transitioning with Grace, written by Nalini, which is a book of inspiring stories of how many people in Ananda left their bodies. And you can read those stories. Many of them have these examples of just the person craving something. And I've seen also on the other end of things, you just never know. I've sometimes seen mother and daughter who were close like this throughout their lives. Suddenly the mother starts deeply distrusting the daughter 3 days before death. Like, in an irrational, psychotic way, not like in a personality-based way. Because there's some attachment, detachment. You don't know what karma it is that brought them together. You don't know what the soul is trying to resolve. We know nothing. And all of those things that somehow were all hidden under the iceberg all this time suddenly just randomly start precipitating. And the last thought that we have at the time of death is often a precipitation of so much of what has been processed and accumulated and suppressed in the subconscious. It is actually quite humbling to think about how little control we have over those things unless we are consciously processing and working on it when our bodies and minds are doing well. So it is important for us, and it is also true, again, any of you that have had these experiences, it is one thing to think of conscious death, but it is almost, again, from my very little experience, which is not more than 4 or 5 people that I've stayed in close touch with through that phase, most people do not have a sound mind or a functioning rationale when they reach close to those gates. There is an irrationality that enters in your being, especially if it's related to old age. But even beyond that, I've seen that even with people that are not very old. And these are all, again, the way I see it and my presuppositions or understanding of how I see it. Anybody is welcome to correct, or others may have more experience than I do. But these are all ways in which that subconscious, all of the unlearned lessons start precipitating at that moment of death. And this is the part that I think I wanted to read. The last predominating thought of a dying person is weighted down with the habit tendency of a lifetime. It is not good to overburden this consciousness with the fear of death. This is master writing. It's part of the same writing that I read same section about how he describes the process of death itself. The dying man should be told nothing, or if he is a brave man and wants to die, whisper into his ears, cross the portal of this woesome life into the vista of an everlastingly happy life. Again, he goes on again, talking about a lot of the details, which I won't read now. But it is just a thought that I wanted to share before we finish the discussion for today, which is that moment of death is the summation of all of our life. So the more we befriend, the more we process, the more we accept the cycle of what all of our lives is, that moment is less stark, it's less shocking, it's less irrational. It's more just a continuation of everything that we have been doing all of our lives, and not suddenly a break from reality where we are introduced to things that we did not expect to see. There is another part of the Gita which I'll briefly share again before passing on to Saranya, because this is important in this topic and I don't want to revisit the 8th chapter next week. I may not have time. I'm going to skip many verses, move forward. Again, as part of your reading assignment, you can go back to chapter 8. Swami says regarding these verses 824, 825, 826, he says, these are some of the most abstruse and esoteric in the whole of the Bhagavad Gita. I'm not even going to read the verses because they are abstruse and esoteric. Basically, Krishna says, fire, light, daytime, bright half of the lunar year, 6 months of northern course of sun, pursuing this path at the time of death, the knowers of Brahman go to Brahman. Smoke, nighttime, dark half of the lunar month, the 6 months of the southern course of the sun, following the path at the time of death, one attains the lunar light and so returns back to earth. These two paths of exit from the body are eternal alternatives. The way of light leads to freedom, the way of darkness leads to rebirth. It's actually very similar to how the Tibetan Book of the Dead also presents this. And this teaching is phenomenally misinterpreted in most of India and Indian tradition, because the Sanskrit words, in case for people that are from India that will relate to this, that Krishna uses are these phrases Uttarayana and Dakshinayana. And they actually relate to the transit of the sun. So from mid-January to midsummer is called Uttarayana, And from midsummer till mid-January, the fall and the winter, late summer, fall, winter months are called Dakshinayana. So the way these verses are interpreted is people who die in the earlier part of the year attain liberation, and people who die in the later part of the, it's the Bhagavad Gita. If you have any faith in it, and if that's the interpretation, you already start doubting. I feel like he meant something else. I just have a sense that that's probably not what he intended to say. And there are many things, even in the Mahabharata, I won't, maybe if I have time, we will revisit this next time, even related to Bhishma's death. Bhishma lies on the bed of arrows to wait for this transit of the sun, and he wouldn't leave his body until this particular transit happens. Now, the only comment I wanted to make, or to briefly summarize what Krishna is talking about here, is rather esoteric. He's talking about the flow of energy in the spine, how when we are approaching and being drawn and absorbed in the superconscious, there is a way in which energy flows through the subtle spine, that it is being drawn more and more towards the Sushumna, and it allows the Kundalini to ascend. And there is also a course. And we go through this duality constantly in our lives. We go through all of it. I mean, not all of us, but those of us that are devotees, we are aware of both the lunar and the solar course. And the lunar and the solar course, again, in the chakra system, we are simply talking about this is the moon and this is the sun. We are talking about the medulla and the spiritual eye. And the course of the sun and moon that we are talking about is the circulation of energy through the spine. And this is why, they say one round of Kriya is equal to 1 year of spiritual growth, because we are talking about traversing the planets through the chakras. Now, again, these are all esoteric concepts. I regret needing to go through this so briefly. But the point that I was trying to make is, for those of us that are consciously drawn to the spiritual path, we are aware of both those courses. We are aware of when we are drawn and when we are absorbed, and we are going into deeper meditation and into that ascending flow of energy in the spine. And when we are aware, when we are drawn into the negative tendencies of our own consciousness, fear, hopelessness, regret, whatever it is, that is deeply, deeply imbibed. That's part of how we relate to the world also. And how do we leave the body through the solar course? Again, the point that Swami makes in these commentaries, it is the summation of your life. It is not an accident. It is not suddenly that now you can die during your inhalation and not your exhalation. It's not that. It's just that when we are constantly training ourselves, being aware of what that lunar course is. He talks about it. He talks about smoke is confusion. Darkness is ignorance. He talks about how the extent to which we live in our senses, the extent to which we are preoccupied in this world, and that defines the major part of our day and our motivation and how we lead our life. That's going to predispose us constantly to be in the lunar course. The extent to which we are drawing ourselves outside of that and trying constantly, through whatever it is, it's not like all of us have the ability or the luxury to sit for 3 hours or 4 hours in meditation every day. But again, in the commentary on these verses, in Swamiji's Gita commentary, he talks about that's not what it is. Raising Kundalini is about positive thinking. It is about expansiveness. It's about every single thought and attitude that you have and how mindfully you're going through life. And the extent to which all of our focus as we go through life is to draw ourselves away from the senses, we are becoming more and more familiar with the solar course. And what happens at the last moment when we are about to leave our body, again, is a summation. Is a summation of all that we did and didn't do throughout the 60, 70, 80, 90 years of our life, trying to learn these lessons that we have not yet learned. So, I went 5 minutes over time, and I'm going to pause there without any time for discussion or questions. I think it's going to be very hard. Maybe the last class we'll try to create a different structure if people want that. But we will pick up from some of these ideas. I want to talk more about the idea of befriending death, again, from Swami's teachings. And for those of you that are in the room, I handed out Swami's essay called The Final Exam. If anybody's watching this online, I'll send it over email, or if you don't have access to it, if you end up seeing this later on YouTube or somewhere else, you can write to me and I'll be happy to send you a digital copy. So the hope is that we can all read that before next week. And then I hope that next week's discussion will be to talk explicitly about hope and faith and attitudes that we are developing constantly that are going to ultimately turn our relationship with death, a full 180, for us to really consider befriending and seeing these transitions and disease and pain and all of that differently than how we might be naturally inclined to. With that, I'll pass the microphone over to Saranya.